Government has always been a massive threat to liberty. I think we can all agree on that, right? But there's actually something that's significantly more dangerous, what the founders and the old revolutionaries called the doctrine of passive obedience and non-resistance. On this episode, I'm going to highlight their words to explain this in a little bit more detail, with a bunch of great quotes from leading founders and old revolutionaries like James Otis Jr., Samuel Adams, John Dickinson, Patrick Henry, and an awesome one at the end to wrap it up from Thomas Paine. But first of all, before getting to that, welcome and thank you for joining me here on the Path to Liberty. My name is Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the Fast Friday edition of the show for September 20th, 2024. Let's get right to it. I want to kick it off with this great quote from Samuel Adams, writing as Candidus in the Boston Gazette. This is the publication of the Sons of Liberty, 1771. He said, "The truth is, all might be free if they valued freedom and defended it as they ought. The father of the American Revolution recognized it was up to the people to protect and defend their own liberty, their own freedom, whether government happens to like it or not. And if the people value that freedom and take a stand in support of it, they're going to be free no matter what anyone has to say. It's sometimes, well, it's not super easy, especially if you let it get out of control, but it can be done." George Washington had a similar take in his circular to the states in June of 1783. He said, "At this auspicious period, the United States came into existence as a nation. And if their citizens should not be completely free and happy, the fault will be entirely their own." Again, a little bit different in the messaging, but still the responsibility for protecting and defending their own freedom is the people themselves. And John Dickinson, who's known as the penman of the American Revolution, he was the lead author, maybe the primary author of the Articles of Confederation, especially early on. And here he is writing in Fabius number 4 in support of ratification of the Constitution in 1788. And he said, look, a good Constitution promotes, but doesn't always produce a good administration. Words on paper can't stop government from doing what government wants to do, but you can create an environment where it's more difficult for them to do the stuff, well, that government does, which is, well, rob people, violate their liberties, take their money, etc. But then he, of course, had the essential question that followed this up. He said, "But notwithstanding, it must be granted that a bad administration may take place." I guess these days that sounds like an understatement by quite a bit. But a bad administration may take place. What is then to be done? Dickinson said the answer is instantly found before the supreme sovereignty of the people. Sovereignty meaning final authority. So the answer to a bad administration is the final authority of the people. And Dickinson said, "It is their duty to watch and their right to take care that the Constitution be preserved." Or in the Roman phrase on perilous occasions, to provide that the Republic receive no damage. So in order to understand the absolute wrong way to go about this, providing that the Republic receive no damage, the number one thing that's given us constant usurpations of power, let's understand what that is, the largest government in history. Let's look at some principles back in the early parts of the American Revolution, even further back before that as well, and listen to the advice, warnings, and strategies from what we should really call the real greatest generation. And I want to kick that section off here with a quote from James Otis Jr. in 1762. He pointed out that so long as people will submit to arbitrary measures, so long will they find masters. Arbitrary power is power that's exercised beyond the limits of what is authorized to government. So if you've got a written constitution, it's pretty clear. Now, arbitrary power was also listed as what we call grievances, but really the injuries and usurpations in the Declaration of Independence. And James Otis is like pointing out, when they do this stuff, as long as you comply, you're going to find people who are very happy to do it, and more and more and more. It shouldn't be any surprise that you have all kinds of arbitrary power when you have submission. In his resolves against the Stamp Act in 1765, I think he had just turned 29 years old, like 10 or 11 days earlier, Patrick Henry pointed out that the people are not bound to yield obedience to usurpations of power. Specifically, he was talking about internal taxation on this issue. But the principle, of course, was much broader. And Dickinson took that same principle and ran with it as well in his broadside against the Stamp Act later in 1765. He said, if you comply with the act by using stamped papers, you rivet perpetual chains upon your unhappy country. So compliance to John Dickinson was putting chains around your own country, ending your own liberty. And he explained why. He said, you unnecessarily, voluntarily establish the detestable precedent which those who have forged your fetters ardently wish for, to varnish the future exercise of this new claimed authority. TLDR, when they do stuff that they're not authorized to do, if the people comply with it, they have no reason to get rid of it. They're never going to get rid of it. And in fact, government, because we recognize human nature, government always seeks to expand its power. Human nature, we're all very flawed creatures, and those who are in power will always try to expand their power. Once you give them that detestable precedent of doing one thing they're not authorized to do, even if it's a tiny thing, you've given them power to do more and more and more and more. So Dickinson summed it up with this. He said, the Stamp Act, therefore, is to be regarded only as an experiment of your disposition. If you quietly bend your necks to that yoke, you prove yourselves ready to receive any bondage to which your lords and masters shall please to subject you. Man, that could just sum it up right there. That is really powerful stuff. But here's John Hancock writing just right before the Stamp Act was going to go into effect in late 1765 to his London agent, Jonathan Bernard. He pointed out that the people of this country will never be made slaves of by a submission to the damned act. So whether you could convince government to repeal something or not, the mentality was, well, first of all, we're going to take a stand for what we believe in anyways. And in fact, for many, that wasn't just a good idea. It was actually a duty. And for that, let's go a little further back to Thomas Gordon writing as in Cato's letters in 1721. These were highly influential on the founders and old revolutionaries, widely published, widely read. This is, I think, letter number 42. And we can recognize here that the founding generation, the revolutionaries, they didn't come up with these ideas. They didn't make them up. They were just implementing them. In fact, they went back years to people like Gordon, but way further back, all the way to the ancients, as we'll see here in just a moment. And here's how Thomas Gordon put it. The law of nature, and this will be linked to in the show notes, just like all the original source documents I'm citing here. I'm just scratching the surface with a few quotes to hopefully encourage you to read and learn more in context on your own time. Alan Mosley will organize a blog post for this episode like he does for every episode we do, and I'll get it published a couple of hours after the live stream is done over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. So that's all spelled out, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. Let's look at Gordon here. The law of nature does not only allow us, but oblige us to defend ourselves. It is our duty, not only to ourselves, but to the society. So this kind of a moral view of things was that it wasn't just a good idea. The people are not just not bound to yield obedience, but it's a duty to resist usurpations of power. It's a duty to resist and stop arbitrary power. And then Gordon cites Seneca, who is one of the ancients, Roman philosopher. I guess, would we call him one of the ancients? Sure. I think he passed away in the early 1st century. But Seneca put it like this. If we suffer tamely a lawless attack upon our property and fortunes, we encourage it and involve others in our doom. And you can see how that kind of messaging permeated what the penman of the American Revolution, John Dickinson, said in response to the Stamp Act. Once you comply, you've established a detestable precedent. You're voluntarily giving them more power, and we shouldn't be surprised when they wield that power in worse and worse ways over time. And then Gordon cited Cicero. He said, Cicero says, he who does not resist mischief when he may is guilty of the same crime as if he had deserted his parents, his friends, and his country. Now, John Adams, in his dissertation on the canon and the feudal law in 1765, he referred to this. This is the doctrine that I mentioned at the beginning of passive obedience and non-resistance. It's not something we talk about really today. This was a specific doctrine where people were they had to either follow it because of some ancient powers telling them we just have to comply with whatever government does. But the founding generation, the old revolutionaries specifically, despise this. And you can see this through and through in writings from people like John Adams and others. Here's Adams back when he was one of the good guys, the Atlas of Independence, before the switch flipped some years later. But he said it was the most mischievous of all doctrines, that of passive obedience and non-resistance. And decades later, writing to William Tudor Sr., this is 1818, I believe, he pointed out that if the orators on the 4th of July really wished to investigate the principles and feelings which produced the revolution, they ought to study this pamphlet that he's referencing and Dr. Mayhew's sermon on passive obedience and non-resistance. He's referencing Jonathan Mayhew, who did a sermon in 1750. Here from Teaching American History, their overview of this point out that in commemorating the history of the regicide, referencing the execution of Charles I, Mayhew reminded his audience of the long English dissenting tradition in which the Christians are held to have not only a right, but a duty to resist government whenever they fail to secure the public good. The public good, public happiness is, well, for government, it should only be to follow the rules and nothing more. Now, I'm not going to highlight, if you guys are really interested in Mayhew's take on this and some of the other things that Adams was referencing, let me know in the comments, and maybe I can put together an episode on that specific set of documents as well. But that'll be linked to in the show notes so you can read it in full on your own time. John Adams thought it was incredibly important. He was far from alone. It was very popular throughout New England. I'm not sure as much in Virginia in the South, but I'm certain it was published in many places. So a right and a duty was the mentality. And we can see how James Otis Jr. took this and ran with it in The Rights of the British Colonies Asserted and Proved, 1764. He said, "He that would palm the doctrine of unlimited passive obedience and non-resistance upon mankind is not only a fool and a knave, but a rebel against common sense, as well as the laws of God of nature and his country." So you're one of the bad guys if you're telling people, well, not you, of course, but one is one of the bad guys if they are telling people, hey, you just got to do what government tells you, and then there's a system to try to convince government to stop doing what government was never supposed to do in the first place. To the founders, to the old revolutionaries, especially to people like James Otis Jr., you're a fool and a knave in that situation, a rebel against common sense, because this is stupid to do this. It is absolutely absurd to think that that's a good idea. And then, of course, you're a rebel against the laws of God of nature and your own country, because if you're supporting your country, you don't want a government that runs roughshod over the rules given to it. Well, at least you would think. Now, jumping forward a little bit to Samuel Adams, this is back to his great essay as Candidus in 1771. He takes this same position that it's not just a good idea to take a stand for your liberty when government, violates it. Well, for us, that's 24/7, 365, but it is a duty. He took things from a very strong moral perspective. He said, the liberties of our country, the freedom of our civil constitution are worth defending at all hazards, and it is our duty to defend them against all attacks. And then he followed that with a paraphrase or a version of that same quote from Seneca that Thomas Gordon highlighted in Cato's letters. He said, "Let us remember that if we suffer tamely a lawless attack upon our liberty, we encourage it and involve others in our doom." And he summed it up by pointing out that it is a very serious consideration, which should deeply impress our minds that millions yet unborn may be the miserable sharers in the event. So if you stand idly by, you turn a blind eye to a lawless attack on the Constitution, on your liberty, then you are not only, dooming yourself, you're dooming millions yet unborn. It's a very immoral approach to people like Samuel Adams. We can even look at someone like Alexander Hamilton, writing in Federalist number 33. He's not my favorite guy, but this is some interesting stuff. He's discussing the supremacy clause for the proposed constitution at that time. This is in January of 1788. And he's saying, like, look, they can't just do whatever they want. Not everything that the federal government is supreme, only those things that are pursuant to the delegated powers of the Constitution. And he says acts of the large society, that's the federal government, which are not pursuant to its constitutional powers, will be merely acts of usurpation and will deserve to be treated as such. Will deserve to be treated as such. Usurpation is a theft of power. The supreme sovereignty of the people are the source of all power. The people of the several states in our system, they delegate power to various governments. And if government goes beyond that power, those limits, they are usurping, they're stealing power. This is arbitrary power, which was one of the injuries and usurpations, as I mentioned in the Declaration of Independence. And hopefully, even going just through this so far, hopefully it's pretty obvious what it means when we say it will deserve to be treated as such. Refusing to treat usurpations as they're supposed to be, according to James Otis, is the number one destroyer of liberty. In other words, sitting idly by, complying, and hoping they go away magically is the number one way to destroy liberty, according to James Otis Jr. He said, there is nothing that will destroy liberty more than a prevailing opinion that it is better tamely to submit than nobly assert and vindicate our privileges. There is nothing. Now, maybe somebody else thought something different, but James Otis Jr., pretty important guy in the Revolution, said this is the number one way that liberty is destroyed, is through compliance with stuff that they're not authorized to do. And so we can see why today we live under the largest government in history is because most people, for decades and decades, for generations, when they see the federal government, for example, doing something that they believe the federal government shouldn't do, they spend all their time and energy trying to convince the federal government to stop doing what the federal government was never supposed to do in the first place, and then it never does that. It says, thanks. In essence, what the people have been saying for generations is stop, or I'll say stop again. Now, that doesn't mean that turning things around from where we are today to where we want to really be, which is a real land of the free, is going to be quick or easy. But as Thomas Paine put it in the American Crisis number 4, 1777, those who expect to reap the blessings of freedom must, like men, undergo the fatigues of supporting it. Now, I don't know who exactly needs to hear this message, but I think as long as we live under the largest government in history, we probably all need to hear it over and over and over again. And nothing helps us get this kind of information out to more and more people every single day, more than the financial faith and support of our members. You can join us for as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. So if you got a couple of bucks of that dirty government fiat, please consider throwing it our way. We punch way above our weight class here at the TAC, and I'd be extremely grateful for any consideration you can give to joining us today. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options. 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. And while I'm here, I want to take a quick moment to say a huge thank you to just a handful of people who have joined us recently as members. There's Damon in Michigan. Thank you so much. Tracy in Ohio, Larry in Missouri, Lori in Arizona, Richard in Virginia, and Carol in Florida. I'm so grateful for your support. And if you're able to join them as well, please give us a hand over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. If you're not able to contribute financially, no sweat. We're going to keep doing what we're doing no matter what. We're going to push on because that's our duty, as Samuel Adams and so many others have told us. But there are a number of ways you can help us spread the word, free and easy peasy, like smashing the like button, leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platform, comments in the archive, subscribe, get notifications. All these various things can help trigger the algorithms of the mainstream platforms and tell them to show us to more people. I'm extremely grateful for your help and your support. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope it made you think. I hope you learned something. Hope you have an awesome weekend, and I look forward to seeing you next week here on the path to liberty.